I would like to thank the ICS not only for helping us organizing, but also sponsoring for the event. And a special thanks also to the Departmental Research Initiatives Fund at the King's College Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, who have also generously contributed towards this colloquium. It always costs money to do these things if we want to treat ourselves really well. And with thanks to those institutions for really helping out in making this a wonderful day. Okay, without much further ado, I will give this over to our first panel, which will be chaired by Alicia.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rosa, can you remind me the panel time for this is 10:15?
So we have 10:15 to 11:30, yes, then coffee at 11:30.
So now you all know when the coffee break's coming. Try something slightly more complicated as an introduction. I'm going to probably my video. Many thanks to everybody online and in the room for joining us this morning for our first panel, Scarcity. We've got 3 speakers. You can see online there my colleague Elena Miguelez Carvallera from Bangor University. I'm Alicia Kent. I'm from King's College London. And our third speaker today will be Gethan Wang. I'm also from our Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at King's College London. As an introduction to our panel then, I want to talk very briefly about this text. This is Spain, this is Spain, an incomplete travel guide published in 2014 by the No Photo Collective. And this is the flipbook Vimeo of the guide on their webpage that I'm playing you now, if you want to have a look at it. This travel guide is a collection of contemporary images of Spain, complete with illustrative texts and black suspended points on red maps, which broadly describe some of Spain's autonomous communities and regions. Some of the images are peopled, others are empty. In line with recent headlines about Catalonia, the Balearics, and over-tourism, the images of Barcelona and the beaches of the Costas Brava and Dorada are colourful and densely populated with human life. In contrast to the following black and white chapter you're about to see on the more northerly rural Camino de Santiago and the Galician coastline. Through the guide, we move through Spain's more and less well-known tourist attractions, its hot and cold spots, as well as through the rural and urban landscapes, still bearing the marks of the push towards tourism and the marketing of a different Spain during the Francoist dictatorship, particularly in the images of Benidorm, which hopefully you'll see before I finish. Tourists and locals sit alongside one another, and transient animal populations move through the green and arid and industrial and artistic and sporting and flooded landscapes. We also see evidence of the burst construction bubble and the wider ruins of the global financial crisis from 2008. Landscapes scarred by the steel skeletons of unbuilt properties and a partially constructed football stadium, which looks like the Colosseum. All life is here. All keeping on the boards. Density, nothing. Not enough here, but we've got that. In this channel, our focus will be on scarcity, and we'll talk about the rural and the urban, hot spots and cold spots, and remote island life. And more thank yous from me. We're very grateful to our Languages, Literatures and Cultures at King's College London Departmental Impact and Research Initiatives Fund for the contribution towards the catering those of us in the room will be enjoying today. And we want to thank our organisers, Jakob Stugard-Nielsen and Rosa Muciniak from UCL and King's respectively, for the invitation to participate in what looks to be a wonderful day of discussing the interrelation of comparative literature and the environmental humanities here at the Warburg Institute in London. I will also thank Jenny Stubbs and Joe Ford, thank you, from the School of Advanced Studies and the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies for all their assistance with the planning and running of today's event. So let's start then our panel with our first speaker, Helena. You can see there online. And her paper is entitled Scarcity, Nostalgia and the Rural Turn in Spanish Contemporary Literature. Helena, I'll let you share your screen and I'll stop sharing mine. Oh, look at that one time. Hopefully.
Thank you very much. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah, that works, Helena. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Alicia, Jacob, and Rosa, for this invitation to be present at your event today, albeit virtually. It really is an honor for me to have this opportunity to share some aspects of my recent work on the Spanish rural turn in culture. More generally, and also more specifically on this emerging cultural emotion that I will be discussing with you today, that we'll call scarcity nostalgia. And I thank Alicia for inviting me to be part of this panel, because it was precisely that sort of cue to think about scarcity that got me thinking about how this might be playing out in the Spanish rural turn in culture. So in recent years, rural landscapes and lives have become the focus of a steady trend in Spanish cultural production, a trend that has been accompanied by a burgeoning of critical analysis of the rural in the academic field of peninsular cultural studies. And I'm giving you there just a very tiny snippet of the most recent publications. There have been many others, edited collections about sort of new imaginaries of the rural in Spain, and several different monographic issues of leading journals. Undoubtedly, the contemporary rural turn in Spanish cultural production is part of the wider and pre-existent phenomenon of environmental concerns appearing within the arts and humanities. Read as a response to the planetary challenges posed by the climate emergency, the adoption of eco-critical frameworks in cultural analysis has made room for renewed treatments, if you like, of the rural, which is now seen in some quarters as the once neglected domain where contemporary societies can access a repository of sustainable and collective practices that are essential for imagining livable futures. There are several historical factors that help explain the vigorous engagement with the rural in present-day Spain. The country experienced a belated and significantly accelerated rural to urban mobility during the 20th century, particularly in the second half. As a result, there is a living memory of that often traumatic process of moving from rural environments where usually a subsistence economy was still very much applicable to more urban settings, and sort of lingering connections to familial properties in the countryside. Additionally, Spain's heightened vulnerability both to the global financial crisis of 2008 and to the effects of climate change, with droughts, extreme heat waves and desertification already having a significant impact in the country. This also explains the urgency of this return to the rural as a site that might help us redefine what constitutes a good life. Finally, the COVID pandemic brought about an increase in internal migration from cities to rural areas in Spain as well, particularly of middle and upper class sections of society whose jobs can often be carried out remotely. So as a consequence, it is, in a sense, unsurprising that the theme of urban to rural mobility occupies a central space in recent cultural engagements with the rural in Spain. it could be argued then that while obviously renewed critical engagements with the rural have a global dimension, the Spanish context displays some peculiarities, I believe. It would be fair to say, for instance, that the theme of Spain's fractured relationship with its rural past has erupted with force in the country's 21st century public sphere in a manner that is unparalleled in other neighboring nations. I'm not an expert in Portuguese contemporary culture, but I do try to keep abreast with some of its current debates. And there's a sense also in recent Portuguese film and literature that there's also this surge in interest about the sort of disappearing rural ecosystem and economies. But in Spain, this is without a doubt happening. The relationship between the country and the city, the vicissitudes of rural life, and the disappearing rural environments have, of course, been constant themes in modern Spanish literatures. However, in the second decade of the 21st century, we have seen a wave of renewed cultural engagement with the rural, crystallizing in the publication of Sergio del Molino's essay, La España Vacía, so Empty Spain, also potentially translated as hollowed out Spain, because it refers to this idea that there's vast regions of Spanish territory that have been evacuated, if you like, of populations because of this exodus in the 20th century and late 20th century from rural areas to the city. The book was and continues to be a bestseller in Spanish, in the Spanish public sphere. Was published in 2016, has not been translated into English, but it has been translated into German, as I'm showing there on the slide. In the political arena, there have been reverberations of this debate as well. There is now an España Vacía political franchise, if you like, an empty Spain political franchise. There are several political parties operating at regional and provincial level, trying to sort of give visibility to some of the problems that beset depopulated or increasingly depopulated rural areas in Spain, like lack of services, lack of infrastructure, etc. On the cultural plane, in my work with Dr. Maite Usoz de la Fuente, for instance, at the University of Leicester, we published a special dossier in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies last year, where we deploy, we theorize this notion of the rural turn in Spanish contemporary culture to refer to a post-2016, so, after the publication of this essay, a post-2016 surge in cultural engagements with rurality in Spanish culture. The commercial success of rural-related writing by relatively novel authors such as Jesus Carrasco, who was the author of Intemperie, another sort of rural bestseller translated into English already as Out in the Open, and it was also adapted into film. Maria Sanchez's essay Land of Women, talking about the experiences of a female vet working in rural Spain, and Ana Iris Simon's Feria, published in 2020, are a few examples. I'll speak about Ana Iris's Feria in a moment because it has ignited quite a deep running sort of cultural and political debate in Spain. It was captured, this debate was captured in 2022, even in the New York Times. I'll tell you a little bit more about this book in a moment, but just I'll leave that slide there just to sort of give you some proof of how different debates about politics, culture, etc., are being mobilized around or through writing about the rural in Spain. To explore how these themes interlink with issues such as Spain's territorial politics and questions related to historical memory, trauma, modernization, national identity, and even as well the rise of the far right in Spain and enduring effects of Francoist extractive and biopolitical violence on Spanish rural populations. All of these themes are enmeshed, if you like, in these writings about the rural. And I think in order to sort of historicize why this is happening now and the sort of modulations in which it has happened in the past in the Spanish literary system, if you like, I think it helps us to visualize the sort of meta-narratives about the rural in Spain through a cultural emotions approach, if you like. This is a very simplified, oversimplified chart, if you like, of this sort of history of cultural engagements with the rural in Spain, going from late 19th century, turn of the century, post-disentailment writing. Now, disentailment in Spain, called desamortización, was the sort of central sort of flagship policy of the Spanish liberal governments of the 19th century in terms of agrarian policies. It entails the confiscation of the commons, the confiscation of common lands from rural populations and local councils, and its sellout, if you like, through public auctions. It doesn't entirely coincide with the British enclosures. Obviously, the timeline is entirely different, but the effects on the population were very similar. These being sort of provocation of or generation of a huge exodus of rural populations into the emerging industrial centers in Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, the bureaucratic centers in Madrid. Now, the literatures that accompanied this societal or socioeconomic transformation were very much captured by this theme called the España Negra, the sort of like sordid Spain, deep Spain, obscure Spain, this idea, this fear of the primitive rural. Writers like Emilia Pardo Bazán and the Catalan Víctor Català really made a career out of writing this type of naturalist fiction about the primitive rural populations, sort of contaminating civilized urban populations. The emotions there, the predominant cultural emotion sort of mobilized by this type of literature was fear. Taking a huge leap into the 60s, the 70s, under the Francoist dictatorship and its developmental or sort of economic aperture in the 60s and 70s towards a more liberalized economy. The predominant rural imaginary there was related to the figure of the paletos. This translates roughly as country bumpkins, I suppose. It's a highly stigmatized figure, stereotype that populated Spanish cinema in the 60s and 70s, this rural populations flooding into the cities. The predominant cultural emotion there was very much that of stigma and shame, without a doubt. Now, moving into our present day, with the contemporary sort of España vacía framework, this might be signaling a shift away from previous meta-narratives about the rural, at a time when the rural societies and territories are again the object of a renewed interest as a conveniently depopulated repository of renewable energies, chiefly hydropower, wind and solar energy, as portrayed in many films about the rural at the moment in Spain, like Carla Simon's Alcarrás or Rodrigo Sorogoyen's Asbestas. And the predominant sort of cultural emotions mobilized through these debates, I'm suggesting other people have other views, but I think a predominant sort of cultural emotion that we're seeing today in this type of rural turn in Spanish culture is that of nostalgia, or even solastalgia, to use that neologism, to refer to the anxiety that we feel when we see sort of environmental ecosystems being destroyed. This debate about nostalgia for the rural or nostalgia for an idealized rural past is part of a wider debate in Spain, where there are frictions within the old and new Spanish left, if you like, between exponents of the so-called, there's a term for this in Spain, it's called rojipardismo. It's a kind of roughly anti-liberal workerist left, leaning towards more traditionalist and Spanish nationalist positions. Between this sort of like left-wing worldview against more sort of like identity-centric positions, often characterized by their detractors as woke. This type of debate is engaging with this sort of age-old diatribes about the reactionary character of Romanticism and the ambivalent political potential of nostalgia, crystallizing in collective publications such as the one I'm showing you there on the slide, this book entitled Neorancios Against the Dangers of Nostalgia. Neorancio, it's difficult to translate into English, is something like neo-rancid people, if you like, refers to political positions that adopt regressive views, presenting them as modern, updated, novel, etc. Something like trendy reactionaries or neo-traditionalists. That could be a good way of translating this type of vocabulary. Going into one of the books that mobilized this public debate about the potential of nostalgia or the political dangers of nostalgia for the rural. The book that really ignited this debate was that of Ana Iris Simón, that I mentioned earlier on. It's a book that is framed as a paean to her family's working class origins, as itinerant fairground workers in rural area in the outskirts of Madrid in the 1980s. And she revisits the lives of her parents. She's only in her early 30s, but she's sort of like imagining the lives of her early parents, where they didn't have that much. They were definitely working class, and yet they were able to buy a flat and to raise a couple of kids, and to own property and to have, a fully kitted out kitchen, etc. And this is something that she herself cannot really aspire to at the moment. And she tells us in her book how after trying to start up a life in the city of Madrid, she has resolved to actually go back to her family's place of origin in this sort of inland area in Castilla-La Mancha, because this is where she can have more significant sort of relations, a sense of belonging, where you just make do with less, but you have a much more fulfilled life. Interestingly, this book has been capitalized upon by both left-wing and right-wing positions in Spain. So the Spanish Labour Party in government currently, the PSOE, has very much tried to sort of cajole this author, Ana Iris Simón, into their vision. She's speaking at party conferences, etc. But the Spanish ultra-right Vox is also using ideas taken from her book to sort of talk about, how difficult it is, how disenfranchised young Spaniards feel at the moment, etc. This novel, and I'm going to end my paper with a brief analysis of Jesus Carrasco's third novel, Llévame a casa, so Take Me Home. I think it can be approached as an example of these narratives of return to one's rural home as a form of sort of like personal transition, going from stigma, the images of the paletos of the 60s and the 70s, to pride in one's social class and rural origins, so sort of owning up to where you come from. I think this book very much speaks to that tension in Spanish contemporary society. It narrates the homecoming of a diasporic Spanish young man who has spent a few years in Edinburgh, working part-time in the city's botanic gardens, but who eventually resolves, begrudgingly at the start, but gradually sort of like liking the idea increasingly of moving back to his parents' home in an unnamed rural setting, because his parents are getting on and there's sort of like health issues, etc. I would like to propose that there's a peculiar inflection of the politics of nostalgia that informs this text, which I'm proposing. We call it scarcity nostalgia, which is best captured in this work's representation of the material, the objectual world of this in this case of the protagonist's parents' house, when he moves back and he sees the objects, the material world represented still in that house, which is seen, if you like, in this novel as sort of relics of a pre-neoliberal world. In Llévame a Casa, the Spanish author Jesús Carrasco evokes a profound sense of nostalgia through the detailed and tender descriptions of the domestic objects that are still kept in his parents' home, objects that were commonly found in Spanish kitchens and living rooms in the 1970s and 1980s. The narrative lingers on the modest yet emblematic features of these spaces. So like formica tables, crocheted doilies on TV sets, enamel figurines, plastic-covered sofas, and Duralex kitchenware, especially their iconic tempered glass tumblers. And the narrative imbues all of these very frugal domestic objects with an emotional weight and cultural resonance. Carrasco does not merely catalogue these objects and the sense of material scarcity that they invoke, but also a sense of a familial sort of up-and-comingness, in the sense that these were people, his parents were people from rural origins who were able to access private property. They bought a wee house or a flat, and they were able to decorate it, albeit frugally. These scarce ornamental objects and homeware are narratively portrayed as silent witnesses to familial bonds, that is, as ciphers of a generational continuity that was truncated by the mobility dictum of the neoliberal subjectivities, hence that their son moving to Edinburgh, looking for a different life, obviously an economic migrant, but also, this being couched very much as, cosmopolitanism, and something that eventually he gives up, because that dream doesn't live up to expectations and never really manages to lift himself out of poverty, living as a Spanish migrant in Edinburgh. Through this carefully crafted imagery, the novel reconstructs an atmosphere of everyday intimacy and simplicity in domestic scarcity, allowing readers to access a collective memory that is both personal and national in scope. And here we need to incorporate into our analysis also a sort of like banal nationalist emotions that some of these objects might conjure up, related to the idea of being Spanish as well. Some of these figurines perhaps were a bull, for instance, or I can't show you images, but I had a few images of this, which perhaps would help you visualize what we're talking about. But in doing so, Carrasco's prose becomes an elegy to a way of life that is now receding, that is rendered poignant through this evocative power of the material world. Mobilizing the emotion of scarcity nostalgia, novels such as Carrasco's Take Me Home, Llévame a Casa, announce the emergence of a new post-diasporic, post-2008 politics of belonging in Spanish society, where roots and a recalibrated life expectations necessarily take precedence over aspirational cosmopolitanism and desplazamiento, so the idea of being displaced from your class. So I had another comment there about how this idea of scarcity nostalgia is also playing out in some very recent magical realist takes on Spanish rural past. But I think in the interest of time, I've already run over my time allocation. I'm going to stop here and leave this for the discussion if the audience wishes to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helena. I'll ask you to stop sharing. No. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. That was a really interesting paper, Helena, thanks. And I particularly enjoyed the domestic focus at the end there. And I'm also going to be talking a bit about the domestic in my paper, so that's a wonderful link between us. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that in the questions. Let me just move. I'm going to talk to you today about US science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin's Sword, a short story first published in English. Just going to check. Helena, can you hear me okay? Yeah. A short story first published in English in the New Yorker magazine in 1982. Sword is a fictional account of women's first expedition to Antarctica and is set in South America and Antarctica in 1909 to 1910. This date lies between Captain Robert Scott's two expeditions, start of the 20th century, but after fellow Brit Sir Ernie Shackleton's, and before Roald Amundsen claimed the pole for himself and for Norway. Sword is written as a report, indebted to these previous and subsequent wilderness-conquering travel texts, with a first-person narrator who, contrastingly, has no plans to publish it. As in all good travel writing, the report is accompanied by a hand-drawn map, also by Le Guin, which is titled Mapa en el Desván, or The Map in the Attic, and features fictional place names like the Florence Nightingale Glacier and La Pampa, as devised by Zoe, one of the women explorers. Okay, at the start of the report, the narrator registers a desire to go and to see. This is contrasted with the desolate landscape the women explorers encounter on their arrival, the void of Antarctica. A similar language of emptiness is used throughout the report. The whiteness of the great ice barrier, the edge of the world where there is ice, silence, and the continent of white weather without shadows, without visible horizon or any feature to break the level, where there was nothing to see at all. Scarcity, then, as a metaphor here, has its parallel in Le Guin's unembellished language. In his 1975 discussion of the utopian narrative, and specifically Le Guin's utopias, US literary critic and political theorist Frederick Jameson introduces the concept of world reduction as a form of narrative experimentation, comparable to the existing use of analogy and extrapolation in science fiction. In Le Guin's science fiction, world reduction is, according to Jameson, an operation of radical abstraction and in which what we call reality is deliberately carried and really there. Both fields were covered in the decade after Jameson's article, and it's all speculative on science. I think this reading of world reduction can be seen in the use of the brain of the warring lands. Considering the political implications of Le Guin's fictions, Jameson writes, it is in the latter novel, and here he's talking about The Dispossessed from 1974, that the device of world reduction becomes transformed into a socio-political hypothesis about the inseparability of utopia and scarcity. Jameson is writing from a Marxist perspective, and Le Guin's novel The Dispossessed imagines an anarchist society separated from another capitalist civilization. Jameson underlines the economics of Le Guin's literary strategy, the massive commodity environment of late capitalism that has called up this particular literary and imaginative strategy, so world reduction, which would then amount to a political stance as well. In Sword, this political stance is clearly feminist. As we might expect from the Spanish south of the title, Le Guin's women explorers come from across the South Americas, Peru, Argentina, and Chile, with a husband in Ecuador, a convent in Bolivia, and a warship named Uruguay. The women's middle-class status is confirmed by their deception of wintering in Paris as a cover for the expedition, as well as the Veuve Clicquot champagne they drink in celebration of reaching significant milestones. Le Guin explores the intersection of class and gender, describing the women as, by birth and upbringing, unequivocally and irrevocably all crew, as opposed to officer class. In criticism of feminism's whiteness, perhaps evoked by the narrative's void white backdrop, is addressed in the language of the time by the female protagonists from the global south, who benefit from the knowledge of indigenous communities, whether they are being rescued by a tiny pirogue run by Indians, or eating potatoes frozen and dried according to an ancient Andean Indian method, which were perfect sledging rations. The female crew's collective politics is underscored by their group decision-making. Their gendered expertise in housework and looking after babies is juxtaposed with their scarce education, the women having had no training in any science, nor the opportunity for such training. It's interesting to me that the teaching of cooking and even housekeeping has been subsumed into the lexical field of the sciences. In secondary school in the UK, their study is named domestic science or home economics, arguably a tautology given the Greek economics, meaning the running of a household, or currently food technology. Yet in Sword, when the women arrive at the hut built by Scott and rearranged by Shackleton, they find the area around it to be disgusting. A kind of graveyard of seal skins, seal bones, penguin bones, and rubbish, with the hut itself dirty. Empty meat tins lay about, biscuits were spilt on the floor, a lot of dog turds were underfoot. This causes the narrator to reflect that housekeeping, the art of the infinite, is no game for amateurs. For me, Le Guin's shift from science to art in her discussion of work traditionally gendered as feminine acknowledges the lower status and economic value of a training in the arts when compared to that of the sciences, while also privileging the same space of art as a place of possible imagination. In her commencement address to US Women's Liberal Arts College, Bryn Mawr, delivered in 1986, so 4 years after publishing Sword, Le Guin describes art as a skillful and powerful way of being in the world, adding, I come back to words because words are my way of being in the world. In a reversal of the usual binary of women indoors and men outside, Le Guin's women are the ones exploring the vastness of Antarctica and the men reduced to the indoor detritus they left behind. The paring back of Le Guin's world-reducing narrative strategy in Saw allows this feminist rereading to rise clearly from the spoils of historical heroism. This contrast is underscored in the final line of the report. We left no footprint. The women's scarce environmental impact is made clear through these words. In fact, we see throughout the text the women's awareness of their environment and their decision to care for it, as the references to their ice camp, their home while they're there, and the animals and birds which accompany them reveal. Instead of using the dirty hut or building their camp above ground, the women dug out a series of cubicles in the ice itself, with a larger communal area, storage tunnels, a toilet, a sculpture workshop, and sleeping tubes, which the sailors who stayed helped make their bays called coffins and wormholes. But the narrator describes their burrows with pride, clarifying, a little warren or prairie dog village served as well, permitting us as much warmth and privacy as one could expect under the circumstances. The women explorers draw on animal practices for their habitation, rather than the failed scientific knowledge of previous and later expeditions. They stash food along the route for their journey further south towards the pole, and they show their professional housekeeping in pre-preparing their own enriched rations. Once base camp is established and the explorers begin their journey further south, they again confront a white place on the map, that void. Only this time in the void, they flew and sang like sparrows. Jameson suggests that the scarcity of narrative utopias offers a breathing space, a momentary relief from the overwhelming presence of late capitalism, presumably for both Le Guin's characters and readers. He argues in Le Guin's science fiction, his example this time is The Left Hand of Darkness from 1969. There's a subterranean drive within it towards a utopian rest of this kind, towards some ultimate no place of a collectivity untormented by sex or history, by cultural superfluities, or an object world irrelevant to human life. The women explorers flying and singing together as sparrows appear liberated in this scarcity, but they still show awareness of their place in the sexual and historical hierarchies of human life, even as they shake off some of the cultural and capitalist trappings of their class and gender. The human desire for an object-filled world is replaced in Sword with the primacy of satisfying biological need. And even in the void, the explorers communicate with the bird and animal life around them. The explorers see orca whales playing and spouting in the sunshine of that brilliant southern spring. Elderly penguins and skua gulls escort and accompany explorers on their visit to the hut. And Berta, one of the two chief architects of the women's burrows, carves sculptures of Weddell seals into the ice before the women pull their sleds like husky dogs on the journey south. Even the yelcho, which transports them to and from Antarctica, is described as una vaca valiente, or a valiant cow. And yet, as Jameson notes in Le Guin's narrative strategy of scarcity, it includes its own critique as well. The women may fly and sing together as sparrows, but the real trees for these metaphorical sparrows are nowhere to be seen. In the void, there is no real or fictional plant or insect life. Only the ice caves of azure and violet bring colour to the scene. On arrival, the narrator feels home at last, even as she sets foot on earth, which is barren, cold gravel at the foot of a long volcanic slope. But in the narrator's description of the Great Ice Barrier, the climate emergency is foretold. Evidently, masses of ice, many acres in extent, had broken away from the barrier since the Discovery's passage in 1902. In her 1974 book, Le Féminisme ou la Mort, Parisian science fiction novelist and activist Françoise Daubonne coins the term ecofeminism, and it seems plausible that Le Guin, as a French speaker, was aware both of Daubonne and of feminism or death, and her work on ecofeminism, and that we might find its echoes here in Sourd. At the end of the report, we learn the women have completed their expedition. Of the return voyage, there is nothing to tell. Of the return voyage, there is nothing to tell. We came back safe. Le Guin immediately juxtaposes this reduced culmination with the return of history. In 1912, all the world learned that the brave Norwegian Amundsen had reached the South Pole, and then much later came the accounts of how Captain Scott and his men had come there after him, who did not come home again. In a confrontation between ecofeminism and death, Le Guin opposes Scott's heroic death with their traceless explorers. To return to Le Guin's void landscape of Antarctica one last time, I must acknowledge that there is, in fact, one reference to plant life in the report. When the women have all returned to base camp after their successful journey to the South Pole, they discover that one of the explorers, Teresa, has been pregnant all along. After a day-long labour beginning on Valentine's Day, she gives birth to a girl she names Rosa del Sur, Rose of the South. Her birth is duly celebrated with the last 2 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. A child, not a plant, but a rose by any other name. To conclude then, let me return to the beginning and the title of my paper. I refer to 3 terms commonly applied to female bodies, but also found in the description of land in travel narratives: virgin, fertile, barren. In other words, spaces to be conquered, to be sown, and to be set aside. Le Guin engages each of these terms succinctly in Sur. The virgin white land of Antarctica, which bears the names of so many conquests, reveals itself to be barren. The youngest member of the crew transports an unknown seed from another place and time, which blooms in the void. The narrator observes this empty landscape. That is not a place where people have any business to be. We should have turned back. But since we'd worked so hard to get there, it seemed that we should go on, at least for a while. Here, time momentarily loses its forward motion. Once they complete their expedition, the women return home to continue their lives as nuns, mothers, and grandmothers. They write up their expedition reports and then stash them in the attic, ready for the children and grandchildren who follow them. Other than in bedtime stories, the expedition remains hidden, and the landscape is returned to its rest. In this no place of collectivity, the women explorers experience not only space, but also time as gendered. The time of periods and birth, of Valentine's days and heroic expeditions, of linear history and the circle of life, of narratives of scarcity being passed around and down the generations. A time of women and a time of the land, and ultimately the circular time of activism. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Now we'll turn to our final speaker, Gifan Wang, also from King's and from our Department for Languages, Literatures and Cultures there. As we move in my paper from a southerly cold spot to Inga Fan's a northerly one. Inga Fan's paper is entitled Island Trauma and Scarcity, Post-War Japanese Literature. Comparative reading of the works by Oe Kenzaburo and Oba Minako. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alicia. Hi, everyone. My presentation today seeks to understand the intricate tensions between the archipelagic topography, ecological thoughts, and the trauma in the so-called Sengo or post-World War II Japanese literature. So I offer a comparative reading of the writings by 2 Japanese writers, Oe Kenzaburo and Oba Minako, whose bodies of work are significantly influenced by their adolescent and adult experiences during the post-war period, characterized by empathy and negativism. The 2 authors illuminate the complex representations of different kinds of scarcity in the nation state, which include ecological exploitation, nuclear trauma, sexual and political decadence, displacement, and uprootedness. So I would like to quickly introduce the 2 writers. Oe, he was born in this remote mountain village called Ose in Ehime Prefecture in the Shikoku Island, which is the smallest and least populated island among Japanese, the 4 mainlands of Japan. And Oe was, in his own words, a rather isolated child who was remarkably sensitive to the natural landscape of his village, in particular the village's mighty forest and its manifold manifestations. Both Oe's grandmother and mother immersed him in the folklore and myths associated with the village, which he would turn into the renowned village equals nation equals mini cosmos formula. the private mythology that joins together many of his novels. Owe read French literature at Tokyo University and emerged as a talented young writer during his university days. And he started gaining international fame after winning the 1994 Nobel Prize in Literature. And apart from the rural landscape with its own mythology, other important themes in Owe's fictions include the anti-nuclear thought, father-son relationship, urban existentialism, and the carnivalesque logic of death and birth. Owe was also a social activist, notably for his work in the anti-nuclear demonstrations in Hiroshima in the 1960s and his lifelong quest for peace in Okinawa. And Oba was born a few years earlier than Oe, and she was born in Shibuya, Tokyo. And the young Oba traveled with her father, a marine medical officer, to various parts of Japan during the war, including Hiroshima, where her father was sent as a medical relief after the atomic bombing. And the atrocities inflicted by the bombing left a deep impact on the young Oba. And the theme of nuclear anxiety can be seen in many of her works, including the novel that I'm going to talk about today, Shipworms. And in her adulthood, Oba spent over a decade in the United States, studied and traveled extensively. In particular, she studied art at the University of Wisconsin and audited many literature classes at the University of Washington. And she won the prestigious Akutagawa Prize by her first short story, Senbiki no Kani, or The Three Crabs in English. And in her marriage, Oba lived with her husband in Sitka, Alaska, which is a small fishing town, as her husband took up this post at a pulp company at Alaska. And yeah, I think this idea of using fruit and producing pulp is very interesting. So we can think about a little bit on the human exploitation of natural resources in Oba's works. And my research today owes a lot that to Denisa Kabrakova's The Unnameable Archipelago Wounds of the Post-Colonial in Post-War Japanese Literature and Thought. And in her book, she focuses on a group of post-war Japanese writers, including Oba and her contemporaries, such as Ariyoshi Sawako and Hino Genzo. And her research speaks to the various intersections of trauma and sovereignty in post-war Japanese literature through a post-colonial lens. And I think it's particularly interesting that she compares the works by these writers to atlases of remote islands. And she believes that this resonance between the Japanese, the unique archipelagic topography of Japan and the discourses around Japanese literature together speak to the insularity and translatability of Japanese literature and its surrounding criticism. And yeah, the first novel that I'm talking about is called A Silent Cry. It's an English title of always rather intricate and complicated original Japanese title, Manen Ganyan no Futobolu, which literally means football in the first year of Manen. So Manen is one of the eras towards the end of Japan's Bakumatsu period before the Meiji Restoration. And it starts with two brothers from the Nedokolo clan, Nedokolo Mitsusaburo, who is a former university lecturer, and his rather radical and reactionary younger brother, Takashi, who has been referred to as a converted student activist, as he originally participates in the ample protest as a left-wing student activist, but soon changes to right-leaning ideologies after the demonstrations. And the two brothers, both initially living in Tokyo, returned to their family home in a village called Okubo in rural Shikoku, which is modeled upon the geographies of Oe's own village. And an important context behind their return is that there's a very wealthy man in the village who is initially a forced Korean laborer who arrived in the village during Japan's colonial times. And this person who is now nicknamed as a supermarket emperor, for he owns a very influential supermarket in the village. He proposes to purchase this century-old family house owned by the Nedokolos. And the two brothers decide to return to the village to oversee the sale and removal of the storehouse. And I have already briefly mentioned the context, the historical and the political context behind the composition of the Silent Cry is the ample protests which took place between 1959 and 1960, and again in 1960. Basically, a group of quite radical Japanese activists, mainly consisting of university students, they protested against the government signing and ratification of US-Japan security treaty after the end of the US occupation of Japan. And in the novel, Oe also draws influences from the Japanese ethnologist Yagagita Kunio and the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. And the novel starts with a rather intense and graphic imagery of the protagonist Mitsusabulo trapping himself in this uncovered construction pit outside his apartment in Tokyo. And in this confined space, he quickly mediates on a series of tragic events that has taken place in his private life. This include the suicide of his fellow intellectual friend. Sorry, this is quite graphic material here, who daubed his head all over with crimson paint, stripped, thrust a cucumber up his anus, and hanged himself. And other tragic incidents also include the institutionalization of Mitsusabulo's newborn and his wife Natsumi's newly developed addiction to alcohol. And in this process of trying to bury himself with sand and bricks of the construction pits, Mitsusabulo knows that he slowly enters a state of total indifference and that his flesh is assimilated by the soil. And it is very interesting because around this time, the theme of breaking free from psychological confinement against the backdrop of the ample protests in Oe's writings is becoming more and more prominent. And he also relays this quite controversial perspective on the crisis of living in Japan. It was controversial in the way that in the 60s and 70s, Japan was on its way to become one of the world's biggest socioeconomic powers. And Oe, on the other hand, believes that there's this chronicity between Japan's cultural establishment and the country's financial expansion. And another fragment of the novel that I would like to walk you through is Mitsusabulo's wife's greenhouse in their Tokyo apartment. I'm not going to read the whole quote here. I'm just going to quickly address a few sentences. Ever since our marriage, she had been cultivating rubber plants, monsteras, and the various ferns and orchids in a small glasswood conservatory that she'd made on the south side of our combined dining room and the kitchen. Early one morning, after a night of cold that made it hard to sleep, I went into the dining room and peered into the conservatory through the glass door to find that the leaves of the plants were blotched with dark patches. I was knocked by the overpowering raw odor, like the reek of a dog's slobbering mouth that filled the place. Once the smell had seized hold of my mind, the rubber plants and the monsters on either side, all mottled in different shades of dingy green, began to look like tall giants dying where they stood, and the murky mass of broad-leaved orchids crouched at my feet at like a sick animal. And here, I believe that always writing echoes with a notion of the historicity of everyday life, which is an important notion in the writings of Japanese Marxists such as Jun Takasa and Goro Hani, which emphasizes on the intertwining relations of personal sufferings and the political struggles. And then upon their return to the village, the two Nidocolor brothers traveled through this mighty ancient forest at the entrance of their village. And Mitsutobu noticed that over the years, the forest has expanded enormously. And according to this mysterious hermit, who has lived in the forest since forever, the forest was steadily extending its power. As the critic of Owe, Leko Alstead asserts, in Owe's works, the forest offers a haven for fantastic stories that compound the different temporal and temporal dimensions together. And this is especially true the way that Owe he offers different perspectives of reading the village's history in the novel. For instance, he remembers that his ancestors used to cut down timber in the middle of the forest. And then his great-grandparents used this empty space after the timber is cut to train peasant rights against the local authorities for unjust rice tax. And then 100 years later, his radical younger brother, Takashi, utilizes the same space to train his football team. Basically, he trains this group of underprivileged children from the valley to riot against the economic power of the supermarket emperor. And then another strand of this forest mythology in the novel is which is derived from Owe's reading of Japanese ethnologists such as Oliguchi Shinobu and the aforementioned Yanagita Kunio, that the spirits of the village deceased would return from the forest, which is seen as the outside world here, and they can bring potential harm to the valley. And the second novel that I'm going to talk about is Oba's Shipworms. And different from Owe's The Silent Cry, home is not a point of return, rather home in Oba's novel is a point of departure. The male protagonist of the novel is an impersonal name Hanaya, which literally means the florist, travels to a distant and unspecified Arctic island to work as a florist at a resort hotel. And there's a theme of island doubling in the premise of Oba's novel. The protagonist states that his hometown is constantly plagued by this prevalent dampness, which has been pointed out by Fukunaga Takahiko, that reminds the reader of the geographical characteristics of Japan. And in the novel, the hotel utilizes the island hot spring to grow tropical islands in a greenhouse. And there are multiple interesting characters staying at the hotel, including the hotel's female owner, a Black entertainer with a military background, as well as a wealthy prince from a local royal family and his former dancer wife. And amid his interactions with these characters, the florist is constantly tormented by his memories of his half-sister, who's named Ali, which literally means there is, and with whom he has had a sexual relationship. And there are the other very significant themes in the novel, which include the class violence, and this is seen in the decadence of the protagonist and Ali's family estate, which has been uprooted and rioted by local peasants. And Ali's father loses control of the estate due to the transmission of syphilis. And the sexual relationship shared between the florist and Ali results in an unwanted child and eventually Ali's suicide. And here is a short quote from one of the most violent and traumatizing scenes of the novel, which is Ali's abortion. The thing that came out of Ali's belly knotted like a tapeworm. Ali's stomach was hollow and wrinkled. Her entire body looked like a discarded glove, which, no matter how expensive and soft the leather, is hardly a beautiful hand. Very different from the visible blood, tensed fingers and lustrous nails. In the white toilet bowl between her spread thighs, the red tapeworm was swelling up and endlessly wrinkling. Very quickly, Ali said from the operating table. And this quote resonates with Marilyn Ivy's perspective on trauma as expressly modeled on the surgical term for a catastrophic breaking into the body from the outside, piercing. And the repetitive traumatic memory that plagues the florist emphasizes the temporal and spatial distance between the Arctic island and home.
Fine, that's 20 minutes. Can you move to your conclusion?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I would like to quickly wrap up of my presentation. I believe that both Oe and Oba write on the insularity of Japanese literature, and the Oe's approach is more writing from the periphery and criticizing the center. And in Oba's case, she adopts this double vision or island doubles to dissect the tensions between her wasteland, the past of her wasteland and her life in Sika. And I think both writers also call in question the tensions between material abundance and the scarcity in other discourses, cultural, environmental, and psychological. And in both novels, Island is a site of memory, trauma, belonging, and exile. And there's some references. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Just before we open up to questions, I think it would be remiss of me not to say 30 seconds about the existential challenge that we've got to languages departments in the UK in a panel on the topic of scarcity. We know this is part of a sector-wide emergency. According to the Universities and College Union, 1 in every 2 universities is cutting staff jobs and student courses. But we also know that universities are one of the top 3 employers in their town and city, and one of the top 3 exporters in over 100 constituencies. That's according to Sam Friedman and Tim Lunig. Now, I was going to read from Becky Moradas Taylor's work. She's a professor at Leeds, but I'll refer you instead to her article from 2024 in the Language Learning Journal that's about her work on cold spots and her strategic recommendation to open language degree programs at one lower tariff university in each cold spot where there's not enough provision, especially for students from less privileged social economic backgrounds and also some ethnic minority backgrounds who are more likely to commute to university. But I will end on a note of hope. I've seen discussion of cold spots of Becky's work in language provision and other disciplines in the national media, and I've read political commentary offering possible solutions of how to turn around the current situation. I know the solidarity amongst our community and I can see it changing the narrative. So today in our panel, we've tried to showcase some of the work we do and our attempts to speak to the most pressing global issues. So thank you for being with us and listening and questions.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much. So I don't know if you want to stay there or Florida. Here, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to the opening panel for such a kind of beautiful setup of the kind of key questions for the day, to the organizers and the different institutions that were kind of pulling together, you know, in an ever busier landscape to create the space for reflection and for care and kind of consideration. So our panel today will build on some of those questions of scarcity, but also will be slightly kind of more conversational in its format. And we're hoping to kind of have enough time for questions for panelists here, but also maybe to already start kind of building connections from the previous panel. And you know, kind of looking forward, you know, since we're kind of the middle panel, I feel our role is one of a bridge. And from the kind of beautiful ending with the Japanese archipelago, I wanted to just kind of frame the panel with turning to the Caribbean archipelago for a couple of minutes. The title of our panels is Climates of Comparison. It's also after the kind of, you know, the kind of coloniality, environmental humanities, and comparative literature. So I want to maybe foreground also the question of coloniality. The speakers might or might not take it up explicitly, but I think it's something that really I would like to go back to at some point in our discussions. I wanted to start by turning to a fellow Caribbeanist recent trade publication, Dark Laboratory on Columbus, the Caribbean, and the Origins of the Climate Crisis, published by Taoli Goff, a colleague based in the US. And the preface to her work, she comments on those different timelines of the climate crisis. And she writes, I'm quoting, "While it is easy to picture plumes of smoke as the primary output of global warming, we must ask questions about the global economy that preceded our dependence on fossil fuels and that remains unseen. The brutal order of plantations organized the world before there were smokestacks and factories. The economies and ideas of plantation slavery had irreparably scarred the natural environment. Before idyllic pastures, mass deforestation was necessary to clear the way for farming. Plantation owners and overseers mutilated the flesh of those they held captive under their whip. With each tree felled, carbon was released into the atmosphere. Sacred branches, hundreds of years old, that had witnessed the first European colonizers were raised in an instant." And then Tao continues. "While precious metals and rocks, gold, silver, and quarries of marble had long been prized throughout the human history of mining, coal and oil have transformed how the world breathes. Agricultural and mining industries asphyxiate the future. The smoke emitted from fossil fuels burning our lungs as it propels a cycle of greed and disposability. Today, wind currents carry debris from faraway forest fires that irritate our airways as we inhale a sky turned a burnt shade of orange. The air is hazy and thick, with the ashes of dogs have been deemed disposable." So in this kind of poetic prose, she foregrounds kind of fundamental questions the Caribbean, but also I think more broadly of coloniality, the multiple timescales of crisis and the long histories of environmental crisis, histories that maybe need to be kind of re-anchored from the Industrial Revolution to the shores of the Caribbean. And her work kind of, this piece is kind of a more public-facing piece for us in the kind of scholarly debates. You know, she echoes earlier environmental humanities, post-colonial environmental humanities work by Anthony Carrigan, Graham Hagen, Elizabeth Delory, Malcolm Ferguson, and more recently, and many, many others. So the task ahead for us, and maybe that's also the task that some of the panelists want to speak to, is really to unpack the key questions. How has comparative literature engaged with or challenged the kind of post-colonial and decolonial approaches to the environment? And can comparison and maybe our discipline, however frail, serve to enable and foster complex planetary assemblages and offer new political categories? And also, what forms of comparison and what work can that comparison do in response to that coloniality of climate? So today, as a way of kind of answering some of maybe these concerns of the conversation, we have speakers joining us from the beautiful Budapest, Bologna, UCL, myself from Queen Mary. And we're hoping that these provocations will be a starting point for discussion, and we'll have a kind of a generous amount of time for conversation and kind of unhurried. Maybe for once, we don't need to hurry.
Yes.
So thank you, and we'll start with Florian Musung from UCL. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And it's such a pleasure to be part of this. It feels a bit like a family gathering, except my family is not nearly as smart or lovely as the people I'm sitting with in this room.
Not true.
My extended family. And so thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Jakob. And I'm going to read the first part of a text which I'm writing for a publication, which is going to be out with an edited volume on futurability, co-edited by a group of colleagues in Germany. And it's inspired in large part by conversations with Silvia Victornato in the context of Silvia's doctoral work. In fact, I'm going to look at a novel which Silvia also tackles in her dissertation, The High House by Jesse Greengrass. And I just wanted to acknowledge the importance of that space, especially since I think when you have the privilege of supervising a student who you can see is a future colleague in the making, you learn as much as you teach. And I'm really happy to have two people in the room who are who were or are my PhD students and have also been important teachers. Stefano Bellin back there and Silvia here in the front. So it's really nice and serendipitous that you're both here. So a space between two futures, and I'll read for about 10 minutes, and then I'll stop and we'll see how far I can get. Jesse Greengrass's wistfully contemplative novel, The High House, opens with the childhood memories of Caro, a young woman who has survived catastrophic storms and floods and is now passing her time in an isolated, well-stocked refuge on the Suffolk coast together with her brother Paulie and their friend Sally. When Caro was a child, she recalls something appeared to be wrong with people's attitudes towards the future. And the next bit is a long quotation from The High House. She didn't have the habit that the rest of us was learning of having our minds in two places at once, of seeing two futures, that ordinary one of summer holidays and new school terms, of Christmases and birthdays and bank accounts in an endless, uneventful round, and the other one, the long and empty one we spoke about in hypotheticals or didn't speak about at all. Caro remembers that she grew up in an anxious, complicated world where discussions about the future were both apprehensive and curiously inconsequential, a routinization of apocalyptic demeanor. Expectations of catastrophe and convulsive change dictated the tone of her parents' conversations and dominated everybody's feelings and thought, but ordinary life also went on, seemingly unperturbed. Carol remembers that one afternoon, I quote, while Paulie had his nap, Father and Francesca and I sat on the living room sofa and watched an island in the mid-Pacific sink. She recalls how she felt afraid very suddenly and directly, I quote, for myself, end of quote. In such moments, Carol admits she had a clear sense that her familiar world was doomed and that the social arrangements that she had taken for granted were quickly becoming insufficient, inadequate, or unsustainable. Lifestyles that continue to appear normal and unproblematic to most people on most days were in fact grotesque forms of disavowal in a world already on the brink of planetary catastrophe. In retrospect, she remarks, these years of childhood came to seem like a brief period of transition, I quote, when it was still at the beginning of things, when we were still uncertain and it was still possible to believe that nothing, whatever was wrong, bar an unusual run of hot Julys. This is a hot June, of course, now, and January storms. And I'm going to sort of skip a little bit here, in which I draw attention to a few passages which are not so much focused on Carol's experience, but the experience of her stepmother, Francesca, who is a climate activist and climate scientist, and who is endlessly described as torn between the sense of duty towards her children and the equally urgent sense she has of sort of things unraveling and things ending. I'll just give you one quotation. Even Francesca, who saw it all so clearly, even she who would not let herself be gulled by hope, even she stood by the open fridge at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and swore because there was nothing to give the baby for his tea. So again, there is this sense of two futures. There's this sense of, Carol says, in retrospect, this sense of a sort of period of drowsiness that precedes a brusque awakening. She says Greengrass writes, there's a kind of organic mercy grown deep inside us, which makes it so much easier to care about small, close things. How else could we live? So I'd like to say a few words about Greengrass's sophisticated and unsettling use of narrative tense, also narrative temporality at large, and consider some of the wider questions that are raised by her novel. In apocalyptic times, what ways forward are available to us? Is hope merely a coping mechanism, a pretense of sanity in a house on fire, a social routine that amounts to little more than climate denial? What becomes of care, topic which is very dear to our friend Dan, in a world without a future? On a heating planet, must we learn to prioritize the battle for climate justice and planetary habitability over the needs of those who are closest to us? Or should we accept that all forms of care are merely palliative? And I'll say something about prolepsis and retrospection in the novel. And I think I'd ideally like this to be part of a wider reflection on a rather sort of limited and limiting idea of prolepsis in climate fiction, which I would suggest Greengrass both somehow sort of successfully unmasks in her novel and at the same time replicates on a different level. So Carol speaks to us from the future. Her terse present tense narrative reaches us from the other side of planetary disaster. We might call this a form of speculative futurity, were it not for the fact that Carol appears to have little desire to tell us about the broken world that surrounds her. Instead, her story repeatedly takes us back to a fictional past, so analeptically to a past that is easily recognizable to us readers as a realistic depiction of our present and plausible near future. And then I have a bit where I seek to draw attention to this first person pronoun, And what is, of course, very problematic about the first person pronoun in this context, this sort of ours and who is sort of part of this we that I conjure in the text. So I won't read this out on, sort of in a sense, taking for granted that you will share my sense of the sort of inadequacy of this rhetorical we, and at the same time the kind of sort of need, I guess, to rely on it. So I suggest that the High House consistently prioritizes experiences of narrative tense that are broadly social rather than strictly linguistic, in the way in which, according to anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli, and I quote, narratives of belonging, abandonment, and endurance are socially enunciated and experienced, and this depends only in part on the ways that the relationship between the time of narration and the event narrated is conceived, or another way put, between the event of narration and the narrated event, and how this is grammatically marked. So we use the grammatical past tense, of course, to mark the fact that a narrated event is prior to the act of narrating, but it is also possible to convey this idea in the historical narrative that is written in the present progressive. And the comprehension of a literary text is typically achieved through an effort to decode a narrated past as a quasi-present, right? So when we read, say, I don't know, I Promessi Sposi, in a sense, we are sort of there with the action, right? Paul Ricoeur calls this a presentification of a narrative written in a different grammatical tense. So it's really interesting and important couple of books, sort of two connected books by Mark Carey on this, where he suggests that all experiences of reading a novel are generally retrospective in so far as they allow the reader to encounter events that were narrated in the past and are typically written in the past tense as if they were a kind of present, but also proleptic, because this presentification of the past occurs in relation to a future that is also already in place. So when we read a European language novel in paper copy from beginning to end in the right order for the first time, these are sort of quite unusual experiences now. European language, right order, paper copy. I don't know how many of us do that kind of stuff anymore, but let's assume Mark Carey all assumes that this is sort of how we read, but of course his books are now about 10 years older, so we experience everything to the right of our page or of our bookmark or of our sort of focused attention on presentification as already written but not yet known to us. So on the right, sorry, and everything on the left is sort of happening in the past. Now there you go. Peter Brooks called this in 1984 the anticipation of retrospection. Right? I'm going to wrap up because that's nearly 10 minutes. I didn't quite get as far as I hoped, but what I was, maybe we can come back to this. So I have a part on the anthropology of the future and on sort of different forms of anticipation in times of crisis. That's what I'm really interested in. But what I was hoping to get to with, and I'm still sort of in a sense hoping to get to that with the written piece, is this sort of idea that the two futures and this sort of constant, we talked earlier about a sort of temporal loop of activism, right? So this sort of temporal loop of activism is very much sort of explicitly performed and laid bare in Greengrass's novel through this juxtaposition of an imagined post-catastrophic future, which is narrated in the present tense, and analeptically a present, which is narrated to us in the past tense, but experienced by the reader through the sort of habitual effort of presentification. So we are sort of constantly lured back into this mode of reading, which is a sort of mode of presentification, which paradoxically is enforced by the sense that the world of Caro's childhood, which is pretty much the only world we find out about. We find out nothing about the world of Caro's present, next to nothing. The world of Caro's past is our own present. We are sort of very similar to Francesca. Our children are very similar to Caro. And we experience that past tense through presentification, but at the same time, we experience it in relation to a future which in the novel is already foreclosed, the post-catastrophic future, which we don't know very much about because Caro and her brother and her friend are stuck in this house and they can't go anywhere else. So, but the only thing we have is this sort of sense of foreboding and future closure. And I would suggest that that sort of sense of analepsis and future closure is what is interesting about the novel and also what is problematic about climate fiction. If we think of climate fiction more generally as a kind of sort of narrativization of scenarios of global heating or catastrophic climate change, right? We sort of narrate these as if they were sort of scenario planning. What we're actually doing is, of course, we're constructing fictional universes. And so that's what I meant to say. I'm sort of done. Sorry when I say that Greengrass both replicates this mode of climate fiction and at the same time very self-consciously draws our attention to this by making this futurability, this post-catastrophic futurability, both necessary for our understanding of the text and inaccessible to us. Okay, I hope that made sense. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing? All right, good. I just want to say a couple of thank yous to acknowledge the fact that I'm able to be here. So yesterday we had an absolutely great event through the UCL Stampede for the Arts on a Heating Planet. So my participation in this event kind of is linked to that. I thank Florin and Gasha for the invitation to come along and speak here as well. Sylvia kind of for the work in organising these yesterday, and to take an opportunity as well to thank the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies, which has hosted me for a visiting fellowship for the past few weeks. So thank you, Joe, thank you, Charles, and so on and so forth. So a wonderful opportunity to be here, and the discussion. I mean, there's a part of me that would quite like just to respond to some of the things that I've heard already because it's been great. But at the same time, I'm here because I would like to talk about method. And I talk to you as these days a geographer. This is coming from a place where once I was a literary critic and now I'm a cultural geographer, or so they tell me. I just want to spend some time, and I only have a couple of slides today, which we'll see in a second. There we go. So I have one slide which is some things to think with, and one slide which is a couple of texts to think about. And so some of the items that have already been mentioned, I think we'll come back to these in the discussion. But like Florin, I'll just take the opportunity. If I think it's important, we have. Let's say I'll do 8 minutes, and then we'll go from. All right. So some of the things that we've already heard about, and the rationale for this session in particular, it moved me to think about how to read, or how people could read as a vegetarian. So I shall out myself here and say I'm a vegetarian, and I have been for some time, which is an interesting experience in Italy, but pleasant when people get on board with the idea. Some people are still getting on board with the idea, but that's another story. We haven't got time for that. So the motivation for being here today and for this session in particular for me is really about how certain kinds of method come about. So I take a lot of inspiration from the environmental humanities, and in particular from eco-poco work, so post-colonial eco-criticism, in the structures of thought with which analysis occurs. So moving more and more into geography now, into human geography, and into teaching decolonial geographies for the undergraduate program in Bologna. This is a program for historians, so it's general geography. So in talking about the way in which positionality becomes very important in analysis, and what it is that's at stake when certain people are doing the analysis as opposed to certain other people, I got to thinking with a colleague from Padua, Chiara Spadaro, who is an actual geographer, about how, as vegetarians, the two of us could read or could propose a certain kind of practice, a certain kind of practice for reading, but also a certain kind of practice for doing geography. The two quotations that you see here link to some stuff that we've already heard about. So, we've heard about degrowth, happy degrowth, and I do enjoy a bit of happiness in our degrowth. We've heard about trying to think, about agribusiness. The role in which the role of agriculture kind of in the space of rural geography is something that has been written about in articles in Progress in Human Geography that go back to the late 2010s, for example. And here kind of we see so Alicia mentioned Françoise d'Aubonne, Feminism or Death, great book, 1974. And so for me, Carol Adams and the work that has been done around trying to think vegetarianism through several waves of critical feminism, 3 at that point. Now we've had 4/5. So these things are all here as an archipelago. So that's also how I thought about the thinking like an archipelago, in the same way, as Ella Leopold encourages us to think like a mountain. So putting all these things together in that space, working with people like and the way in which those have come through into the environmental humanities into an Italian-speaking space. I just want to offer, as a starting point, Serenella Vino, who came up yesterday, and I'm sure will come up some more. But one of the points that she makes in the book, the MLA prize-winning book for Italian studies, Icarism in Italy, is about food and geographies of food. Now, obviously, she's coming from a perspective of philosophy and studies of Italian literature. But to me, these boundary objects, in the same way, as Rosa was mentioning time before, time geographies are these boundary concepts that allow us to think across and think together. What I would like to do is to encourage, in the space that we have now, to think with food. To think with food geographies and think with our own eating practices, and how this might open up spaces for discussion and spaces for comparison, particularly in the context of what happens with supply chains and what happens with certain kinds of food production in certain areas. So we were hearing about rural Spain before. And then one of the places that immediately comes to mind for me is Basilicata, which has a huge issue, as one of my colleagues, Tim Reimakers, has written about, with migrant workers being co-opted into growing tomatoes, for example. So food as a way to think, and vegetarianism, as Carol Adams points out, and of course there's just been a reissue of this for the anniversary edition. But one of the things that is pointed out by her in that work is precisely about what kinds of vegetarian words, what kinds of vegetarian texts existed that we need to trace, a genealogy of thought. In the same way, there's a rediscovery of certain kinds of being. And the first time that I read this, I will confess that I read Vegetarian Worlds. A kind of allusion to previous vegetarian worlds, and I thought, oh, that would be nice. And of course there are previous vegetarian worlds, as there are previous vegetarian words. And it's this idea of the absent referent. So where it is, thinking about something that might be there, present in the background, or something that has been lost, or something that has been obscured. And Florian made a very good point, as he always does, about being in two places at once and living a limit. And so this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because with the two texts that I'm going to show you, so we have Han Kang's The Vegetarian, South Korea, and Ana Maria Orteza's The Iguana, Italian, both here in translation. So about thinking vegetarianism as being two places at once, being in a limit, living a limit, and how that kind of limit, or that kind of bi-location, if you'll permit me a sort of Doctor Who-esque term there, then how that can actually help us to work with comparison more generally, how that can situate us in a place of saying, okay, this is how we go between, but also how it's possible then to think climate issues at bigger scales and smaller scales. And yes, there was a lot of discussion about scalarity, and I think that comes back here. But I just want to briefly dwell on a couple of moments. One text that is very much explicitly about vegetarianism, or at least it addresses the question of being vegetarian, and the other one which doesn't. And why have I put these two things together? So in the last minute that I have here, what I'm just going to talk to you about is precisely this kind of conversation. So the conversation that you see at the beginning, where the protagonist says that she doesn't want to eat a dish which has a meat element to it, and the reactions that come with that. And these reactions are, again, something that is very pertinent to thinking about climate change. So there's this sense of vegetarianism as somehow a disruptor, as somehow rocking the boat, in the same way as talking about the climate crisis and saying, okay, maybe it's a good time to start decolonizing methodology, is a disruptor. And some people take it well, and some people really don't take it well. And so this scene, apart from the fact that it's very well written and very well translated, it and comes across very well in the stage version as well, I can tell you. This is a scene, I think, which encourages us to think across and between, and indeed conversationally. Sort of say to construct. So how is a person's positionality constructed, and how are positionalities and approaches constructed in a constellation? And then to go to the iguana, magic realism, as you can see from the text, what does it mean to then look at food practices in a text? And this is a specific dinner scene, but also encourages us towards things like species thinking, so multi-species thinking. And also, we've had climate justice mentioned already, multi-species justice, who is included in certain kinds of comparison, who is included in certain kinds of conversation and excluded. These are things that are very present and always have been in comparative literature. And that's why, I've always had great conversations with true comparatists as opposed to mavericks like myself. But I think there's a space here for saying, what is it that in terms of method? So being in a space which says, okay, so what does comparative literature have to offer precisely to talk about boundary objects and boundary ideas in a time of crisis, in a time of climate crisis? And I think that's something that it needs to be made. Alicia was talking about modern languages and threats to modern languages in the UK at the moment. And comparative literature, I hope, will be a bulwark against those threats. I do think this is a time to be able to go out to people and say, there are skills that come from comparative literature and from reading across languages and from reading at the boundary and across the limits and living limits that can open up spaces not only to tackle the climate crisis, but also to tackle the crisis that is facing universities in the UK, but not only, and the crisis of the human condition. I realize that's a bit of a big one to finish on, but we are here for big questions, or at least that's how I understand it. Thank you, Jakob. Thank you, Rosa, for organising, and more talk about vegetarianism either now or over lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, Kasia, for the opportunity to be here. My name is Tünde Varga, and I'm from the Hungarian University of Fine Arts, and I will be presenting with, hopefully with Daniela Jauregui, two major contemporary art projects. They will not be about novels, but about contemporary art. Ursula Bielmann, Devenir University, and her film Vocal Cognitive Territory. And the second is Ajtónkranak Wilderő. And I will connect it to a third emerging one, to Jaguar Negro, which is run by Daniela Jauregui, and the medicine snake from the aspect of decoloniality, ecological activism, and as an attempt of repair. So this is the background literature and then the projects. According to Annibale Chiano and Walter Mignolo, European colonialism not only exploited lands and people, but also imposed the Eurocentric global order. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides.
Oh my God.
Could you share the full screen version of the slides? So probably stop sharing and then reshare.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, probably the full screen just reorganizes everything because I say
Yeah.
full screen, but okay, so I share it again
Again, yeah. Thank you.
and I don't go to full screen. Is that a problem? Can you see the slides now?
Yes, not in full screen. I thought.
Moving.
Yeah, well, probably the full screen. I
Okay.
don't know why it doesn't work. I'm sorry, probably it's better if I leave it this way so then I can go.
Move through them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
okay. Can you still see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
I move on slide. Thank
Fantastic.
you. And I'm sorry, it will be about 10, 12 minutes, not 10, if you forgive me. So according to Annibale Chiano and Walter Mignolo, European colonialism not only exploited land and people, but also imposed the Eurocentric global order that discredited non-European forms of life, knowledge, and governance, in which indigenous people were considered to be part of the natural order, as Donna Haraway points out, also inherited by patriarchy analysis. As Mignolo notes, and I quote, with the imposition of Indian as a new identity, the colonial power aimed to raise millennial cultures, languages, cosmologies, and knowledges, as well as forms of collective organization, governance, and existence tied to the land, end of quote. So they both emphasize the need for epistemic disobedience, challenging Western knowledge systems and recognizing the validity of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other marginalized epistemologies. Decolonial repair, in this sense, is also cognitive and cultural, restoring the legitimacy of suppressed worldviews. The following artworks seek to repair the erasures in dominant historical and epistemological narratives. And my first example is Ursula Beeman, Vocal Cognitive Territory, and also Forest Mind, that's another film she made, which sit in the framework of the project called Devenir Universidad, that is becoming university. The project and the film posits the territory itself as university, as the situated source of knowledge, to quote Haraway again, a cognitive unit, a living cognitive territory. The project exists at the intersection of ecological justice, for more than human agencies, indigenous epistemologies, and it is a model for pluriversity. So the first slide is one of the leaders are talking, who's also a healer. And there's a lot of biopirating going on in the region. About she's saying that they are scientists because, and referring to the ayahuasca, that from 50,000 species, they could combine those two, which are also has the neurological effect. I'm going to return soon. This is the website of the Devenir University. And this is one slide, living cognitive territory that they claim. So the territory itself, the university. And so what Beeman also claims is that intelligence of nature is innate in both human and non-human agents. So that's where she reverses the this kind of European or Eurocentric knowledge. The second example is Aiton Krenak and Anna Dante's project, Vaidere. It was also in the Barbican 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. It also holds deep relevance, not as a conventional artwork, but as a poetic, philosophical, and political gesture. Krenak books like Ancestral Future, as well as the Vaidere animations, propose a non-anthropocentric worldview where rivers, forests, and mountains are kin, not resources backed by the latest scientific findings. So this is the website. There are 7 different animations with which he explains that kind of indigenous cosmology. And so what he claims in the explanatory videos is that it is an educative project, like Devenir University is an educative project to change the flow of knowledge transfer. And both Devenir Universidad and Vaidere enact powerful alternatives to Occidental paradigm grounded in dominance and extraction. Also in tune with Eduardo Cohn's idea of the thinking forest, which extends agency to non-human life not as a metaphor, but as ontological reality. They both redefine human roles as reciprocal, kin-building, interdependent with the non-human world, as in tune with the ideas of Edward Grisson or Donna Haraway. The projects of Cranach and the Ingo people with Beeman dissolve the boundary between scientific thinking, storytelling, art, and activism. So similarly to Beeman's Forest Mind, the other film, Cranach's Salvation Video, connect contemporary science to indigenous cosmology and knowledge. For both of them, for example, as this slide shows, the DNA is conceived as a thread of connecting all living human and non-human vibrant matter, to refer to Jane Bennett. And they both claim that the DNA has the composition of seawater and they emit biophotons. And one of Beeman's recent project was back in Switzerland to visualize those the light that these biophotons emit. Or the Arrow episode on the master plants in Cranach's work that they connect to Beeman, so this is the biophoton, to Beeman and Haraway multi-species existence, as well as to contemporary neurological research like Dr. Diego Borges, who is researching neuropod cells, and he claims that neuropods as cognitive units in the gut are in interaction with the food, like the food as vibrant matter. Of course, he's not using the term vibrant matter, but there is a connection between the food we consume and with the neurological processes of the brain through this kind of gut sense and the brain axis. So I would like to connect these by now superstar art projects to an emerging one in the Caribbean, part of Mexico, to Daniela Jauregui's Jaguar Negro, an art residence in the jungle of Playa del Carmen, Quintana Roo. She founded with Tono Cherny. And within that, to one specific project, the Medicine Snake, which took place this February in Playa del Carmen. Jaguar Negro is located in an ecological community, Pueblo Sagbe, in the jungle of Playa del Carmen. One of the major problems of the city is that it has undergone structural process of tremendous tourist industrial expansion, transforming the Little Fisherman's town, as you can see, it was in the 70s, into a tourism complex with a rapidly rising population. So this is one of the recent images of the same village. The population expansion is mostly due to the growing need for labor that services the diverse demands of the tourist sector. The expansion caused several problems, not only for previously local inhabitants, but also for those who had recently arrived to work among those exploitative conditions. As a first move, Daniela created an umbrella project in Jaguar Negro to provide a platform for local activists to connect in the hope of countering destructive processes. This is Cenotes Urbanos. The peninsula is full of these karst water reserves that are also feed or hydrate plants, animals, and critters of all kinds. And this is one of the guided tours, but they try to re-dignify these caves. So that re-dignification is a non-Eurocentric term. So they not only clean, not only protecting, but they are expert biologists, but they also re-dignify because it was used by Mayan people for certain ceremonies, and that kind of coexistence is absolutely obvious for them. But the second move, so because of those activist groups are upper middle class learned people. So the second move, the project expanded to address the problem of migrant indigenous women from diverse ethnic backgrounds: Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatan, Veracruz, Morelos, and this is a Mayan territory. So these are all migrant people from the neighboring states, and they live on irregular lands outside Playa del Carmen and work precariously in the service of this expanded touristic industry. So the project, unlike Beeman or Cranach, is not only emphasizing the need of cognitive reframing of native territories and native knowledges, but aims to counter the detrimental effects of the ongoing exploitation of the migrant indigenous communities as well. So the project Medicine Snake was a series of workshops and designed as a mutual learning process between the communities and the artists. And the workshop centered on traditional Mesoamerican practices of embroidery and plant knowledge to weave together threads of cultural memory and ecological wisdom. Each workshop took place in a different community in which participants crafted and embroidered an embroidery of a medicinal or poisonous plants. Some of them were even healers, as it turned out from the workshops. The workshops were meant to create an environment in which participants could speak and connect with ease, tell their stories, and acknowledge their shared knowledge of indigenous medicine based on their lived experience of human and more than human agency. So this is a detail of the snake as finally we put together, and this is the snake back in the community. So they could also have a kind of a sense of achievement. And just to sum up, so analyzed through the framework of Keanu or Mignolo's coloniality of power, the project addressed the historical erasure and devaluation of indigenous knowledge systems, the women's embodied expertise in medicinal and poisonous plants, transmitted through oral storytelling, textile art, and drawing, which can be conceived as a reappropriation of indigenous epistemologies countering Occidental scientific or textual authority, as well as the affirmation of pluriversal knowledge systems, or the collective act of embroidery as a means of reclaiming cultural memory while creating a counter-archive rooted in indigenous worldviews. This reframing challenges cultural coloniality of knowledge by affirming indigenous women's medicinal, botanical, and artistic wisdom, also meant as aesthetic disobedience, because, of course, the value system would not appreciate a product as an art product like this one, or it does not fit smoothly into aesthetic values. So the point was to acknowledge it as legitimate and valuable. And the overall aim was to create a mutual trust and learning for establishing future projects that would provide care and repair for these communities beyond symbolic activism. But that's a longer story. So Danielle will answer if she joins us how that will happen in future. Thank you for your attention.
In relation to Anthropocene literature, and I will first briefly recall 3 points in recent academic discourses, and then I will delve into this of emergency, my case study. In the last 2 decades, when the Anthropocene has spread out not only as a geological term, but as a social, cultural, and aesthetic category, literary scholarship has approached the Anthropocene mainly as a set of aesthetical challenges. Many debates focus on the limits of conventional genres in representing the micro and micro scales and entangled agency of phenomena associated to the environmental crisis. Genre fiction instead appears to have withstood the challenge. It is now widely accepted that genres such as sci-fi, dystopia, post-apocalyptic fiction are especially well suited to respond to these aesthetic demands of the Anthropocene. As useful as this approach has been to genre, it seems to me that it relies on a fairly rigid interconnection between certain events and specific genres, suggesting that certain events can only be meaningfully represented within particular generic frameworks. Yet the Anthropocene complicates such a neat correlation by insisting on the interconnectedness across all levels, across all scales. In this context, I think that the category of the everyday Anthropocene may offer a more productive and alternative perspective. The everyday can be reimagined as a space where entangled scales and hidden process intersects. It encompasses the mundane practices, and we just heard how crucial everyday practices are, that form our embeddedness in the material world. The posture of the everyday Anthropocene urges us, and I quote Le Manager here, urges us to pay attention to what it means to live day by day through climate shift and the economical and sociological injuries that underwrite it, end quote. It directs us to track both social, economic, and cultural practices that cause the ecological crisis in the first place and its effects on daily life. I argue then that this perspective reinvigorates a serious engagement with the everyday, seeking to repair, to mend the rift between the lived experience and the temporal and spatial scales of the Anthropocene. I would add that the ordinary dimension of this Anthropocene also resists the sensational narratives of rupture often associated with climate change that have been correctly criticized by many post-colonial scholars such as Yusuf. Even Clark himself, who has theorized the concept of derangement of scales, the idea that climate change disrupts the scale at which one must think and read, notices, and I quote again, reading at several scales at once cannot be just the abolition of one scale in the greater claim of another, but a way of enriching, singularizing, and yet also creatively deranging a text, end quote. Reading practices that only expand the implication of literary text risk making the scale of the everyday life irrelevant in a way that it's too brutally removed from daily interpersonal ethics. These are Clark words. Situating my research in the everyday Anthropocene then is, echoing Arhue's words, an attempt to stay with the trouble. But how does the everyday Anthropocene manifest in emergency then, or my case study? I'd like to open up the discussion of the novel by turning to the very first element we encounter as readers of this text, the title, Emergency. It may evoke expectations of apocalyptic narrative characterized by catastrophe and urgency, and indeed, to some extent, it is. However, from the outset, the novel's tone, form, and content challenges initial expectations. This tension is already signaled by the title itself, which operates on two levels. It invokes the immediate sense of an unforeseen event requiring our urgent attention, and it draws on to its etymological roots. It derived from the Latin verb emergere, which means coming to the surface. It signals a movement of appearance which resonates with the novel's engagement in the slower and less dramatic environmental phenomena. This is how the first paragraph of the novel reads. One spring evening, when I was old enough to be outside and alone, I was sitting above the quarry on the edge of the village when I saw a panel of clay drop away from the facing vertical side and fall into the pool of water. Behind it, the interior of an animal's burrow was revealed in relief, like a bunkhouse, with one wall removed. Inside, instead of wallpaper or darling wire, there was one globe-shaped hole lined with fluff and leaf mold. The narrative continues describing a hunting scene between a bull, whose burrow has just been exposed, and a kestrel. The episode only completes 10 pages later, after a series of digression on the narrator rescue mission of a baby rabbit, an afternoon spent at her best friend's house, and a general description of the rural village of Yorkshire. While the tranquil and lonely rhythms of these initial pages subverts genre expectations, avoiding the apocalyptic tropes typical of climate change narratives, they also exemplify the broader pattern of the narrative structure. Emergency resists a linear description of plot lines. It comprises a fluid stream of events and episodes structured around association, repetition, digression, thematic proximity. The gaze of a child narrator guides the reader into a world marked by absorption in detail. And this world appears as a taxonomy, an ordinary archive of people, animals, things, plants, microbe, and litter. Each one of them receives equal focus. However, how does this meandering structure avoid collapsing into total chaos? At times, the elements of the narrative converge in what I refer to as a fractal narrative structure, a repetition of patterns that creates a space for memory to surface, for a narrative to develop, and for meaning to emerge. One example of this narrative structure is the description of extractive processes of the local quarry. The quarry produces gravel, which was sent all over the world, requirements of Norwegian motorways and new cities in China determine the shape of the quarry and the size of the space it left. The quarry then becomes a site where global capitalist forces leave material inscription on the landscape. The text then extend this logic of inscription to describe other phenomena that affect the environment. Just as the demand for gravel in China carves out the space of the quarry, so too does grief leave a physical imprint on the land. And I quote again, I wonder how many gardens are dug over as a living manifestation of grief. The recurring fractal structure then is one of curving out. Similarly, when the protagonist's best friend Claire falls ill, the narrator again highlights this logic of absence as description. I do not know much about where Claire went or what she experienced, but I can describe how her sickness reshaped the environment she left behind. In this way, the pattern of excavation becomes a framework to interpret and assign meaning to capitalist logics of production, as well as to process of grief and loss. What I'm interested here in underlining is that through these fractal narratives, the narrative generates interpretive frameworks to produce movement and horizontal connection within the text. This framework invite the reader to move across scales from local to global and between material and immaterial dimension. To conclude, emergency narrative program is outlined in the following terms within the text. I like to think that I would go mad if I tune into everything all the time, the squealer's heartbeat or the roar of growing grass, but this is more likely a lie. Realistically, the business of relentlessly prioritizing and deleting the details of the world is the mad element. So avoiding relentless prioritization of details shaped the content and the form of the narrative. Narrating the ordinary dimension of the environmental crisis becomes a project of radical inclusion, one that attends equally to macro process like global capitalism and micro process such as a caterpillar transformation into a butterfly. This narrative strategy also takes on a political significance when it reveals the potentiality to impact future processes of mean-making. Emergency anchors this narrative effort into the formation of new grids, grinds, and framework through which we will interpret the environmental crisis. The narrative strengthens attempts to prioritize often overlooked scales of life, reflect an effort to portray a different and emerging world, one shaped by the epistemological and ethical shift of the Anthropocene era.
So, well, I think that's so. And do you know, is it Amy or Sue?
Probably I think
Do you want to go next, Amy?
I can go next.
When?
Yep.
Stop sharing this one. You have a presentation?
Don't have slide to show, but I do have two physical books. So I'm going to do that while I'm talking. Yeah, and I will be attentive time as well. Yes, so thanks very much to the organizers, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I generally I work on French Francophone and East Asian literatures, but today I want to talk about literary form, especially a fragmented literary form in writings in East Asia, which we can argue are eco-critical, because I don't want to make eco-critical literature in East Asia sound like it is a very coherent or very traditional genre. It isn't. But we can think of the intersection between contemporary environmental humanities and the diverse literary forms we find in East Asian literatures. So firstly, I want to start with saying that there has been considerable attention paid to Anglophone novels and also Anglophone eco-poetry that remind us of environmental disasters that can be stoic or pastoral or lamenting, right? But the discussions of how East Asian literatures contribute to eco-criticism and in very local Asian contexts, I think this discussion is still inadequate.
And we need to actually pay attention to this these contexts because, in fact, Asia, or lots of big cities in Asia, have been altered and destroyed for much longer and on a very, very large scale than anywhere else in the world. And especially during the rapid urbanization since the 20th century, East Asian writers have rearticulated, reimagined their urban environments in very interesting ways. And I think that is what we need now to think of how these urban Anthropocene imaginations can help us reshape some ways we think about eco-critical literature, as well as what are the uses and purposes of eco-critical literature now. Are they for simply I wouldn't say simply, but are they for eco-activism, or is there something more to that? What does literature add on top of activists doing? So there has been obviously a lot of recognition of East Asian eco-literature already, but more limited to discussions of Chinese, Sinophone, and Japanese literatures. And unfortunately, a lot of these discussions do not always get translated into English, nor are they so widely circulated, partly because of particular linguistic expressions that use in these East Asian languages. And we know that language is really important in terms of discussing the kind of ecological data, as well as the local community feelings and emotions around their changing environment. So until only very recently, there has been a kind of rough, broad Chinese translation of what Anthropocene means. 人类世, if some of you know that, but it's not even a term that is used very often in Chinese scholarship, nor a term that constitutes a genre of literature as well. And I think this has everything to do with the fragmented and various literary forms we find in East Asian literature. So I want to just highlight 3 forms. One is the form which we call free prose. And this refers to the Chinese sanwen. And so free prose is a very hybrid form that is not the same as fiction, but it is something between the critical essay, like the kind of essay you would imagine Modern writing, and also diaristic autobiographical reflections, often talking about one's feelings and personal experiences, and also fictional narrative. So this so-called free prose in Chinese writing is a combination of all these different dimensions, which is why it is very hard to translate this type of Chinese writings into the familiar genres we have, such as fiction or the realist novel, as we know it in Europe. And then besides this kind of free prose, we also have the boom of speculative fiction, which obviously is a much more widely known genre. However, what I'm going to say is speculative fiction in East Asia is often very realistic. So there is a strange mixture of really fantastic sci-fi and dystopic elements. But at the same time, you can see this completely realistic and almost sociological observations in the speculative fiction, which again calls into question the very status of fiction of these writings. And often because of the, say, ungraspability of generic boundaries in these writings, there are insertions of poetic fragments. So I just want to give 2 very brief examples, because I think some concrete example is always good at illustrating the theory sometimes. And one example is from this Hong Kongese novel. And this is the 2nd volume of a collaborative novel of short stories called A Dictionary of Twin Cities. Okay, it is not translated into English yet, but as you can see, it is printed in this traditional format and vertically reading from right to left, as find in Mid-Eastern languages. So firstly, these short stories very much are in this free prose style I just mentioned. They are not just fictional. They are very personal. And actually, when the writers, so two writers co-wrote this novel, when they were writing these short stories, they exchanged letters with each other, and they also talked about how these stories came out of discussion groups among friends, came out of a shared sense of precariousness as creative writers, and also the precariousness of life in Hong Kong, because this novel is about Hong Kong and, in avatars of Hong Kong, let's say. And even with the publication of the novel, they also published, they published a sample of the letters they shared to each other with their own handwriting also printed here, which is a rather unusual supplement to read together with the short stories. And what is interesting here, as I said, apart from this really personal and precarious sense that we have from this fragmented prose, is that there is a story here about some girls in a fictional city who are plant girls. So they are kind of merged with a local plant called the gourd, the bitter gourd. And then they start to grow on this site where the government has decided to do a huge land development project. And so these plant girls take root on this construction site and they refuse to move. They don't speak, they are completely passive, but they are just completely unmovable. So then the construction workers are sent in to basically cut down these grow plants, or there is a lot of debate about how they end up. So some people say that, they were burnt. And then some other people say, so in the end, the land development project happened and the girls' bodies were sliced up and built into these buildings, which became luxury flats there. And what struck me in this story is that these plant growers are seemingly completely passive, but at the same time, they use silence, unreadability, and disengagement as their method of resistance. This is almost like a certain metaphor of this type of East Asian literature, which does not call for activism. It does not have a strong political message, but it just does not engage. And it also disturbs the collective consciousness around these really important issues, such as rapacious land development in East Asian cities, which has destroyed local communities. And so its very fragmentary form is a way of saying something without saying something very explicitly, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yes, I'm coming to the end of my slot. Just to mention my second example briefly, this one is by Tawada Yoko, the Japanese writer who also writes in German, and this is a novel she wrote in 2014 in Japanese, and this was translated in 2018. And the thing is, this novel is considered speculative fiction and dystopic because it imagines Tokyo after a kind of environmental apocalypse. But many of the sociological aspects in this novel are almost just a slightly exaggerated version of Japanese reality now, such as the old people don't die in the novel, and old people are extremely active. They work multiple jobs, whereas the young people are very sickly and weak. They can't even walk properly, and it's just good enough for the young people to be alive. And in the backdrop of Japan having this aging population, having the young generations preferring to be lying flat, or another version of quiet quitting, basically, and then seeing employment as slavery, whereas people in their 50s or beyond are working multiple jobs and completely signed up to the hustle culture in Japan. This novel it's not fictional to me when I read it. It feels very realistic, So my conclusion is that I feel that these fragmented forms, hybrid forms of writing in East Asia, very much contest the long novel that has a coherent narrative. And also it contests the kind of eco-writing from which a very strong political message can be very easily extrapolated. Though they are often poetic, they don't necessarily take this form of eco-poetry nor an established genre that would, lament the world or talk about climate activism. Instead, they help us to think about things. And as one of the writers in my primer text said, they risk turning the normal world upside down. And that is their function here. And I think it helps us really reimagine ourselves and also reimagine our responses to the world. But there are no easy answers. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
I'll just echo what Francesca and Amy just said. Thank you so much, Rosa and Jakob, for all my putting this together. It's great to be there. It's great to have the opportunity to exchange with other people interested in comparative literature. Today I will talk about personal narratives and planetary futures. So I will focus on a specific new genre, we could say, a new generic formation, which is that of the climate memoir. I will start with giving a little bit of background about my PhD project. Some of you were here yesterday, so I apologize. I will repeat myself. The project hasn't really changed much from yesterday. It's still the same one.
The supervisor is delighted.
We were trying to slot in the supervision yesterday night to make some progress.
So I'm a PhD student at UCL. I'm in my final year. In comparative literature, of course, and my doctoral project focuses on ecological grief as a cultural response to the climate crisis in contemporary Anglophone, Francophone, and Italophone literature. And more specifically, I study how ecological grief is registered in contemporary prose texts through elegiac modes. So my thesis foregrounds grief as a central affective experience and as an urgent cultural and literary phenomenon at a time of widespread loss. So given that the focus of our panel today is that of talking about genre and questions of genre in general, I'll start by saying that obviously my research uses a generic lens, primarily because I look at elegiac modes in prose texts. But I also consider ecological grief as a vector of generic and formal innovation. So this is what I'm going to focus on now, and I'm going to briefly present one example of that. So in recent years, there has been a proliferation of texts that are, in terms of content, focused on climate change, and more specifically on the affective experiences related to it, which are ascribable to the macro category of life writing. So broadly speaking, these texts show a tendency to draw on the author's personal experience of the crisis and its psychological and emotional impact, but they also approach factual information and scientific data through a distinctively personal lens. So this tendency to, we could say, personalize the crisis is interesting to me, also because what these texts do, they focus on the author's lived experience of the crisis and try to craft these personal narratives. This is evident, I think, across different discursive forms, such as travelogues, documentary writings, and of course, the memoir, my focus today. But it is also noticeable across various other media and forms, since many autobiographical climate-related narratives have emerged in other non-textual media. For example, we talked about it a little bit yesterday, artistic installations, but also comic strips, films, and podcasts, etc. Of course, one could argue that some of these forms are already tend to the autobiographical, like that's the case of many podcasts, of course. But when it comes to literature specifically, I'm interested in particular in the climate change memoir or short climate memoir as an emerging form that uses autobiographical modes of expression and inquiry to grapple with the experience of ecological grief, often from a standpoint of proleptic affective investment in the future, which is interesting also because if we think about the memoir traditionally, it is an account of the past. It's a critical reassessment of the past rather than a form that engages with the future that much. So I think that in terms of generic comparability, it's useful to know that the climate memoir is indebted to the more established form of the grief memoir. And to study that, I draw from Simona Corpo's research on memoir, which has been very helpful. I might have forgotten to show you this. Well, I can see this. So in some cases, the intent of writing a memoir is very explicit. For example, we have it in the title in some cases. I think about a climate change memoir by Brianna Kraft, published in 2023. While sometimes other genres are also relevant to these projects, for example, the travelogue and documentary writing, and I'm thinking of Elizabeth Rush's The Quickening, Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth, also published in 2023. So from a formal standpoint, the climate memoir combines scientific language, often as data derived directly from the IPCC reports, descriptions of physical and geological phenomena, but also many medical terms related to physical and mental health, with a more self-reflective, diaristic, and even confessional use of language. So such a combination of public and factual, with personal and intimate, is also reflected in the style of these texts. They draw from the memoir, the diary, the journal, the epistle, elegy, of course, but also the essay, the report, the opinion piece, the pamphlet, and in some cases, they also feature visual elements like photographs and little sketches, drawings, like that. So, yes, here you have some of the titles I mentioned earlier. Daniel Shirell's Warmth, I focus on that in one of my chapters, is a proper climate memoir, I think. And I will talk a little bit about the Italian example in a moment. So unlike the text that Amy was just talking about, these texts, the climate memoirs, are often motivated by a strong sense of existential and political urgency, and are sometimes related to the author's environmental activism or professional experience. For instance, that's the case of the first example in Italian. I don't think this has been translated. I doubt it ever will. But, the Italian title is Salire in montagna, prendere quota per sfuggire al riscaldamento globale. I translated it Going Up the Mountain, Seeking Altitude to Escape Global Warming. Came out in 2020. This is kind of a mixed form, it's partially a diary and memoir, but it's also a manual of instructions to move to the mountains when the plane gets too warm. That's the case of the Po Valley in Italy, as I'm sure you know. So when it comes to life writing in general, Anna Poletti proposes the category of life writing. So for instance, she focuses on the case of young activists like Greta Thunberg. And to describe her use of personal testimony, she says, and I quote, Greta Thunberg's personal testimony is an epistemic source that demands action on climate change. So in most climate memoirs, the reader is implicated in the narrative through the frequent use of apostrophes, direct questions, personifications, and the use of shifting addresses. Also, I think the climate memoirs try to create a space where to express and navigate climate change-related experiences, such as grief, nostalgia, anger, guilt, shame, but also more positive ones, we could say, like acceptance, preparedness, and solidarity. In particular, the dynamic tension between grief and hope, disquiet and comfort, mourning and finding solace, preparing for the future and taking action in the present is central to this new generic formation. Indeed, I think that the climate memoir is, and often explicitly presents itself, as a literary response to the silence or unease surrounding the expression of ecological grief in public contexts. Consequently, as a form, it responds to a set of new expressive needs elicited by climate-related experiences, especially, of course, that of ecological grief. Additionally, many climate memoirs are also motivated by the wish to confront the self-censoring around certain topics, like, for example, climate-related death, that carry social and relational risk and are therefore avoided in social interactions and conversations. So this is basically what Dan was talking about earlier, the fact that we tend not to talk about some of these things because socially it's considered not very polite or maybe unpleasant. And here I draw from research by this sociologist, Lisa Howard, who writes about the environmental killjoy, the person who ruins the dinner party because they bring up climate-related death, right? And the fact that nobody wants to be that person. So it becomes difficult to address these things in social settings. What's also interesting to note from a clinical perspective is that there is some evidence that the process of recording and working through grief or autobiographical forms of writing may have some psychological benefits. For instance, in their paper on loss and the narration of meaning, Robert Niemeyer, Dennis Klaas, and Michael Robert Dennis claim that identity
can be seen as a narrative achievement. And discourses of grief, whether spoken, images, written, grief accounts in popular literature, or both apologies, attest to the quest of meaning that better aligns beliefs and assumptions with experiences, especially unwelcome ones. This was, of course, a quotation, end of the quotation. And I think that applies to many autobiographical accounts of ecological grief. So the act of writing combines introspection with the impulse of sharing with others. And in this case, of course, the others are the readers. So it represents an attempt at moving beyond the merely private internal experience of grief. This is even more significant in relation to ecological grief, because traditionally grief memoirs focus on identifiable instances of loss, for example, the death of a loved one, or a particularly bad breakup or divorce, forced migration, miscarriage, etc. I'm thinking of texts like The Year of Magical Thinking and texts like that. While the climate memoir contents with a much less clearly delineated sense of loss, which can of course be felt alongside more better defined losses, but it's this wider sense of loss that often has a very important collective dimension. So to conclude, I think that some of these texts pioneer a mode of engagement with ecological grief that attempts to hold together widely different temporal and spatial scales, as well as complex and sometimes contradictory affective experiences. So to return to the original question, what is the usefulness of a generic approach in comparative literature methodologies in the context of the environmental humanities? I would say that thinking in terms of genre, obviously with a degree of fluidity, can be very productive, can still be productive to identify certain patterns and tendencies in contemporary texts, like, for example, writing. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
So yeah, thanks again to all for organizing this. For what I'm going to present is part of a paper or an essay that I'm writing, or that I'm actually revising after the peer review said that I had to leave out all of the basic Marxist stuff. And I'm not sure if he thinks or they think that Marxism is basically my rendition of it is, but I've left out basic Marxist stuff here today as well. And I want to talk more specifically about the link between affect and genre. So it feels like to me like this proliferation of research that focuses on emotional and psychological effects of the environmental crisis has led to a list of emotions and coinages that are related to climate change, like ecological grief, obviously, eco-anxiety, but also some nostalgia, we've heard before today, nostalgia, melancholia, and so on. I think all of these point to a kind of disruption of the subject's affective economy at a more fundamental level of desire and attachment. It creates what you could call an affective displacement. People are displaced outside of their attachments and desires that they had, for instance, for their coming of age, their sense of the future, but also particular acts that now have become sort of unwelcome, or like us, now seen to be damaging for the climate and for one's environment, right? And this loss of affective grounding in general raises then questions of genre, which I understand with Lauren Beland as a form of an effective expectation of how a narrative or how a life will unfold. And this, as the environmental crisis rearticulates the social, the narrative, the effective coordinate of what the life can be, there will definitely limit the planet, or I don't know, but everyone knows. So she suggests that there's a struggle for genre right now, right? Testing out new patterns, as Sylvia has just done, what Francesca has also shown on Amy as well. So all these naming, coining of new genres as well. I will do that too, by the way. But so the testing out of new patterns of living in a world marked by the conditions of the Anthropocene. So here I will focus on one particular affective response and then a particular genre that I think kind of expresses it, right? So I want to focus on what I call, or others have called, eco-neurosis. And so from the awareness that one's social reproduction, or just being alive, sort of contributes to the existential, the ecological crisis, the eco-neurotic sort of polices their everyday consumption and lifestyle patterns, while simultaneously also remaining attached to the normalcy of life on the capitalism. So the neurosis then exists in the kind of compulsion of this pattern and the often self-flagellating feelings, thoughts, or actions that result from it. I think we all know this kind of behavior, right? It has many objects, and I think many will be familiar. So the econeurotic can, for instance, get stuck on all the meat that's in the barbecue. You can get stuck on having a BLT because the vegetarian options weren't that appetizing in the conference. Not this one, but lunches. It's about all the plastics that you find after you went shopping, and of all these products that come from Spain or even further about that have been brought to all these damaging logistical chains. It's about all the cardboard of all the Amazon boxes that bring you books on climate change. Occasional but still too frequent flying. Disposable coffee cups, standing under the shower too long because you don't know what you say tomorrow at the conference, right? And all these kinds of actions, which if they do not actually bring pleasure, there at least is a certain satisfaction in performing various activities that collectively amount to what is considered a recognizable. In all of these actions, there's a kind of nagging awareness that they are in fact no longer permissible because they harm the environment, that they make that particular life that one is leading actually unthinkable in the future. So then the econeurotic, I think, is kind of stuck in a double bind. And they're attached to the climate cause, or they're invested in climate cause, trying to change something about it. But on the other hand, they're also still attached to this fantasy of the good life that is very much related to consuming, to owning particular things. Because the idea is there that they will bring happiness. So in both of these attachments, they don't really find a kind of contentment. They are left with a kind of effective residue of shame or guilt, because there is no certainty about the sufficiency of their actions. They're constantly, in a way, returned or forced to return to the scene of the crime because that scene is actually their life. So I would then like to suggest that aesthetically, this econeurosis gets kind of expressed through the genre, or maybe it's a mode of the complaint. And so according to Gilles Deleuze in his Abécédaire, the affective structure of the complaint resides in something being too large for the subject. What is happening to me is too big for me, either in misfortune or in happiness, he said. And what could be larger than the climate change? Like Nelson in her essay on freedom has this line: talk to anyone about global warming for just a couple of minutes, then you're likely to get some variation on "I just can't deal. It's too depressing, too overwhelming, too paralyzing, too sad, too frightening, too unimaginable," end quote. So Deleuze links this kind of complaint to a sense of social exclusion, the idea that you are no longer part of the social group, that you are no longer protected by your society. And who could feel protected in a society that allows the primary causes of climate crisis to generally continue undisturbed? So, but whereas Zadie Smith kind of sings an elegiac "What have we done?" About the climate crisis, the econeurotic or the complaint is rather lamenting what is being done to me, right? In the session organized by Sylvia and Dave.
He's my brother, but that's okay.
I know your brother. No, so there we go. So that Daniel, sorry. I had the first two. The artist.
Are you saying we were complaining?
What?
Are you saying we were complaining?
No, you were not complaining, but the art.
Alice?
Yeah, I wrote. Yeah, why? Oh yes, yeah. Alice Cunningham. Sorry. Beautiful work, by the way. She was saying, "Why am I human? Why am I? Why do I have to deal with this human legacy?" Right. That's kind of the complaint. What is being done to me? Right. what is being done to me while I'm actually merely participating in daily life, while I'm merely participating in the everyday. And then the complaint kind of functioned as an attempt to find social reintegration, to become recognizable again as a subject that belongs to the social whole, to complain together and to voice negative feelings, to complain about the weather, as well as the emotional or the political weather or climate, with a mutual request for the other to understand you, to understand your predicament, to include you again in a kind of effective community, that you have someone, I understand, I get it, it is too much. So the effective expectation of the genre then sort of becomes a kind of this vague belonging that can sort of undo the troubling social antagonisms in which we live, social contradictions in which we live. And that's where I want to conclude that sort of both in the roses and the complaint are kind of an effective and an aesthetic form of mediating, reading here on Jameson's famous phrase of like the imaginary resolution of a real social contradiction, right? They are both trying to resolve the contradiction either at the effective level or at the level of the genre. And that contradiction is very simply the contradiction of scales, right? The vast, temporary, spatial scale, of political scale in a way as well, of climate crisis, and the so much smaller individual scale. So the difficulty, if not sheer impossibility of acting upon that contradiction is felt and acted out in echo neuroses and expressed and given aesthetic form in the complaint.